the opportunity to present this afternoon. The title, as you can see, of my presentation is Rethinking Muslim Family Life. My research interest is in Muslims as a minoritised group, and my research focuses on the specific context of UK society, although the arguments that I'll present today are relevant to understanding Muslim family life in other societies where Muslims are minoritised too. So I first want to address why I'm using the category Muslim specifically. Important to acknowledge that the category conceals a great deal of intersectional heterogeneity, and using it risks perpetuating reductionist, essentialising accounts of Muslims. So why rethink Muslim family life? Briefly, the circumstances of living in UK society means that Muslim families share certain significant commonalities, and paramount among these is the experience and impact of anti-Muslim forms of racism, and these draw on stigmatising Orientalist perspectives and dominant Eurocentric understandings of both Islam and Muslims, resulting in marginalisation and misrepresentation. So Muslim families have come to be seen as a key site for the reproduction of problematic, potentially dangerous beliefs and values, and viewed through the narrow lens of culture and ethnicity are positioned as a problem to be addressed. So using the category of Muslim also encourages consideration of the role of Islam in Muslim family life and how it shapes traditions, norms, values, albeit in complex and diverse ways. So recently I've been engaging with some of the key conceptual and theoretical approaches in family and relationship studies to consider their relevance and applicability to understanding Muslim family life. And so this is what I'm going to share. I'm going to share some of this with you now. And what I'd like to do overall today is to draw your attention to how the concept of extended family requires critical examination. Ideas about the meaning and role of extended family are generally employed uncritically in making sense of Muslim family life. So critiquing this involves paying attention to the enduring kind of reductionist binary between apparent individualistic nuclear families on one hand and then collectivist extended families on the other. So my aim is to suggest that rethinking Muslim family life involves interrogating unsupported assumptions about the continuing significance of the so-called extended family. And I want to suggest that these get in the way of understanding transformations in family life. And if I have enough time, what I'd like to do is give you some examples from my own research activities towards the end. Okay, so just moving the slide along. So thinking about decolonising approaches, which obviously is what the seminar series is about, which encourage us to engage critically with the history and politics of knowledge production. These highlight how principal traditional theories of family have been based on Eurocentric perspectives, ignoring colonial and post-colonial encounters and reflecting racially unmarked white universal norms. So considering Muslim family life has been noticeably absent from some of the key debates in family and relationship studies. In terms of classical social theories, these reflected, going back to classical social theory, reflected the idea that the interests of advanced capitalist societies were best served by smaller families with fewer children and fewer generations sharing a household. So the shift from tradition to modernity was very much related to a decline in the extended family and also a decline in religion, a decline in family as a major source of beliefs and values. So this association of the extended family with the pre-modern in classical social theory has implications for the way that Muslim family life is still being viewed today. So extended family is arguably a privileged marker of difference for Muslims, and it works to position Muslim family life as backward, bounded by tradition, different from the norm. And this signifies the kind of durable latent Orientalism, which encourages a focus on cultural differences and sees differences, beliefs, values as fixed and impossible to change. So these are unreflexive and inflexible notions of extended family, and they contribute to problematizing Muslim family life. Moving on to the individualisation thesis. So the individualisation thesis and critiques of it indicate a kind of internalisation of a colonial episteme, meaning that colonial ways of thinking about the world shape the production of knowledge about family life. So families that, the family lives of others who don't, so-called others, who don't fit universal and Marx's universal norms, Eurocentric norms, are routinely excluded from arguments about the declining significance of family. So we know that the declining significance of family argument has been challenged, and for example, influential critiques from looking at families positioned as non-traditional, such as LGBTQ families. Another example is Black feminist scholars who critiqued dominant white feminist accounts of family life. And these accounts, which concentrate exclusively on patriarchal oppression, fail to reflect the specific circumstances of families that don't conform to the kind of white normative ideal. So Muslim families are less likely than Black families to be viewed as deficient, as they are seen as conforming to conservative family values, so the imagined traditional heteronormative family. But despite this apparent and dubious advantage, Muslim family life is problematised through the association with extended family. So this brings colonialist ideas about civilizational backwardness into the mix, so that Muslim family life is viewed as separate from changing normative standards in modern society. And not conforming to dominant trends towards individualisation. So rethinking Muslim family life really does encourage further critical reflection on the extent to which family life has been transformed by individualisation, and this artificial dualism between collectivist extended Muslim families and individualising smaller non-Muslim families can be challenged and unpacked by doing that. Moving on to the cultural turn, so the more recent studies of family life, recognising the continuing social significance of family while avoiding limitations arising from privileging the concept. Again, key contributions have considered the relevance of gender and sexuality, so taking into account single parent families, blended families, LGBTQ families, etc. So race, ethnicity and religion have arguably been perhaps less of a focus overall, but they're clearly instrumental in exploring the complexities of contemporary family life. So rethinking Muslim family life can help to further extend the cultural turn to include families outside of the kind of unmarked normative ideal. There are lots of examples I could give, but I just want to kind of briefly mention two from the kind of cultural turn in family and relationship studies. And the first is the concept of family practices, so David Morgan's concept, which I think is useful and can be applied to thinking through Muslim family life, because it focuses on relationships and activities, so groups of activities and how relationships are negotiated. It provides a way of challenging stereotypes of Muslim family life as being resistant to change and wedded to regressive cultural practices. So the lens of family practices or David Morgan argued himself that the lens of family practices is seen as one of a range of intersecting lenses through which family life can be viewed. And he highlighted class and gender practices in particular, but obviously highlighting connected lenses of race, ethnic and religious practices are of central importance to thinking through Muslim family life, and includes examining how family practices are shaped by various experiences of discrimination. The second example I want to provide is thinking about the concept of family display, which Janet Finch's concept, which is also, again, really helpful in thinking through Muslim or rethinking Muslim family life, because it's a concept that isn't wedded to nuclear or white universal standards. It facilitates critical engagement with extended family because family display acknowledges that families can stretch across households and can stretch across different places. The emphasis that the concept of display gives to displaying to different audiences is also important, because it recognises the social pressures on family members to present to various external audience that their family works. And I think that this is particularly relevant to Muslim excuse me, families, because who are seen as unconventional, positioned as problematic, because they don't reflect dominant, unmarked universal norms. So it's a concept that provides room to consider experiences related to living as a minoritized group. And lastly, the conceptual and analytical lens of family. So those scholars in favour of retaining the concept of family draw attention to how, despite its problems, it enables us to capture important aspects of lived experiences and to engage in political debates about family policies. So retaining the analytical focus on family is potentially again helpful in rethinking Muslim family life, because it opens up for examination the relevance of ideas about extended family again. So exploring if and how family life is shaped by collectivist cultural practices and traditions, and the extent to which it places emphasis on collective identities over individual ones. So arguably, it promotes an openness to examining ways in which family is an enduring source of belonging and identity, and to viewing identity as social in the sense that the collective and the individual occupy the same space. So in giving more weight to the collective, it provides room to consider the circumstances of family that don't conform to individualising normative ideas, and the related significance of family life as a source of support and also a source of resistance in a society that problematises Muslims. Now, arguments against using the concept of family have been heavily influenced by moves away from viewing family as an institution. And this isn't straightforward because family practices and relationships are to some extent governed by institutionalised rules and conventions that continue to shape social action. And in terms of rethinking Muslim family life, this includes considering the enduring influence of Islam and also how various statutory interventions impact on family life. So, for example, how Muslim family life is affected by developments in law, politics and policy, particularly developments that ignore the specificities of Muslim family life and also rely on unsupported assumptions about extended family yet again.
Sorry, Joe, if you could just wrap up, you're running out of time.
Oh, okay. So I was going to provide some examples from my own research, but I don't have time to do that. But so I just would like to sort of sum up by saying that I think my recent research activities point to the importance of challenging the extended family as an uncritical marker of difference, and also opening up questions about Muslim family life that help us to both address stigmatising Orientalist perspectives and dominant Eurocentric understandings of both Islam and Muslims more generally. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. And sorry for cutting you off. I was trying to be generous, but also, think about the other speakers. That was, I think that was the perfect, we didn't really plan it out that way, that was definitely the perfect presentation to start off with. It really gave us a kind of a grounding in the different areas, which I think is going to be relevant for all four talks. So thank you so much for doing that. Just for those of you that have entered a little bit late, so what we're doing is we're having the four presentations one after the other, and then the Q&A will be at the end. So next up we have Julie Walsh, who is a lecturer at the University of Sheffield, and her research interests focus on family and migration. And she's an ESRC New Investigator Research Fellow working on social care practice in the north of England and the migrant families accessing the services that they provide. And this study brings together Julie's research interests and her previous career in youth and community work.
So can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Your camera's off though.
Okay. Oh, but can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
You can't see. Start my video. Good. So we're all right now, yeah?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay. So, hello, and thank you for inviting me here today. The paper I'm presenting is co-written with Asma. Asma's in the audience and will hopefully come in on some questions later. So I'm presenting the findings from an ongoing collaborative study funded by an ESRC New Investigator grant. And the overall aim of the study is to examine the impact of the UK's hostile environment towards immigration in social care practice and the impact on migrant families that social care practitioners support. So in the paper, I'm going to present some early emergent findings and make two key contributions. So firstly, I'm going to argue that in the UK, normative conceptualizations of family practices can act as an everyday border. And I'll also show that interactions between social care practitioners and migrant families can also be transgressive in challenging those borders. Theoretically, we draw on the concept of everyday bordering. So although the primary site of immigration control is perceived to be at national borders, in contemporary life, the ways in which immigration is controlled and surveyed are multiple, and they increasingly permeate everyday life. And underpinning this, literature considers the role of immigration policy in the management of so-called dangerous others, who does and does not belong, and the ways in which it continues long-standing patterns of colonial power. Our analysis also positions race as a pervasive social construct that shapes the experiences and individuals as a result of racialization. So the process whereby visible attributes, so largely skin colour, are used to make judgments about other people's abilities, characters and values in ways that impact negatively on life experiences. And scholars of critical race studies argue that colonial rule relied on such racialisation to maintain power, and that this continues to influence migration legislation and a new racism. So as social and political contexts shift, racism continues to be based on skin colour, but this sits alongside emergent forms of racism, where distinctive and visible social and cultural group practices, including family practices, can also be used to make judgments about people. So as the decision-making processes of social care professionals are recognised to be highly dependent on changing societal contexts, those who support migrant families have to balance the complex needs of migrant families with state bordering requirements and also operate within the context of racialised narratives that we've described. So here, the lens of decolonisation allows us to examine if and how colonial patterns of power permeate social care practice, and if and how this results in the inclusion and exclusion of some migrant families. So briefly, the fieldwork for the project is ongoing, and we're working with organisations in 2 cities in the north of England, so Hull and Sheffield. Within this, we're working with practitioners from a range of professional backgrounds. Our work with migrant families is in progress, so the data that I'll present here today is from fieldwork with practitioners. So overall, we found that practitioners' descriptions of migrant families with whom they work do display wide-ranging knowledge of these families and their local communities. Practitioners spoke about an awareness of cultural values and norms and the importance of being sensitive to these when providing support services to families. But we also found that these descriptions could include generalisations about some ethnic groups and their familial practices, some of which reflected long-standing racialising cultural tropes shaped by residual colonial narratives in British society. And some of these acted as potential borders to whether and how migrant families receive or accept social care support. I'm going to provide a couple of examples. So a number of practitioners spoke about the difficulties in communicating with Muslim women, and this was attributed to the common practice of women arriving at a first appointment with their husbands, who were likely to interpret to speak for their wives. So as consent has to be gained directly from the person accessing the service, if a woman cannot speak English, a husband cannot translate for her, and an independent interpreter must be used. So one practitioner here says, we often find we have husbands that bring their wives to us because the husband can speak English okay and they want their wife to learn, and they want to interpret for their wives. They don't want to get an interpreter, but we can't have that. It's because we're not allowed. You know, how do you try and explain to them that we have to get our own interpreters. You're put in a very difficult situation because they're not happy. So whilst Lucy expresses that this requirement can be difficult to navigate and feel uncomfortable, some practitioners also see a woman relying on her husband to speak for her as indicative of her subservience and the family's distance from white British cultural norms, rather than a familiar way of helping her to understand what's being said. And Sue says, for example, sometimes in these ethnic minorities, the husbands can be quite domineering of their partners. I'm very conscious that we have to accept that it's the nature. It's just that women are more subservient in some of these cultures, that the man's the head of the household and they accept that there's nothing wrong with that in their culture. So in turn, this results in some assumption that a man interpreting for his wife can be positioned as abusive rather than supportive and or culturally located. As practitioners supporting families, checking for signs of domestic abuse is of course an important part of their role. But that does mean that couples in this position are subject to an additional layer of racialised surveillance, which is articulated here by Sue. So often husbands can to us appear very dominant and they will want to speak for their wife or partner. And again, it's the weighing up of, is this dominance a caring thing or a cultural thing, or is there a problem here? We have to be very careful because we can't judge. So practitioners do deal with the perceived cultural differences by being sensitive and non-judgmental, and at times they express discomfort. There is, however, a tendency to make generalisations about gender norms within Muslim families, which can affect the work of social care practitioners and potentially impact on the services and support that families receive. In addition to this, we also found that practitioners' descriptions of Roma and Romanian families, a term that was often used interchangeably, were influenced by racialised stereotypes, with communities regularly described as unruly, closed and difficult to engage. Irina in Hull, for example, describes Roma families she supports as not forthcoming and not expressive. They don't give much away, they're quite guarded. And Annabelle adds to this, expressing that this, combined with structural restrictions, limits the ways in which Romanian families, positioned as a homogenic group, can be supported. And she explains that you've got to build this trust, and that's really hard. If you're only going in sort of like once a week, that they let their guard down and start talking to you. Similarly, in Sheffield, the practice for Roma families as a group are seen to be the practices of Roma families as a group are seen to be at odds with those of other families, grounded in an opinion that a lot of the Roma community do want to stay up late. They are in large families. They want to have dancing and parties and music and dance, you know, there's just differences. Members of Roma families are thereby identified as regarding support from services and with specialist expertise in a separate group setting from other service users. So Jo, for example, explains that when she and colleagues started to work with young people within Roma families, they decided to reach out to other people working within the city who have more experience than we do at working with the Roma communities. And she expands, saying that these young family members kind of came as a tour de force within the group. And actually, we really had to review what the original safe space kind of needs were of the original group of young people, from the young people from the asylum-seeking community, and who have had really difficult stories and really difficult journeys, kind of slightly at odds with the behaviour of some of the Roma kids. So a search analysis shows that practitioners can make generalised assumptions relating to Roma families as being antisocial, so a long-held racialised trope. And by framing their difference as an obstacle to engagement, this does have implications for the relationship these families have with social care. However, whilst analysis does show that practitioners can enact symbolic borders, evidence of practitioners navigating borders when working with people that have migrated to the UK is pervasive, as is the fact that bordering practices consistently create problems for both families and practitioners. On one level, practitioners repeatedly describe how they work against the impact of the hostile environment when supporting families, be this in terms of dealing with immediate crises, such as providing access to basic items, including food, or providing more detailed advocacy. As such, it's the immigration system that shapes the support some families need, and in working with people to manage these issues, practitioners can resist features of the hostile environment. We also heard multiple examples of practitioners working tirelessly to navigate complex systems of entitlement and to identify alternative sources of help when immigration status denies a family member access to state support. Practitioners subsequently expend significant amounts of physical and emotional labour in order to meet the needs of migrant families, including working over their contracted hours, advocating with external organisations, and investing considerable amounts of emotional labour. In the quotation here, I asked Simon how it feels when he's unable to work with someone because of their migration status, and he describes this in his and his team's response. It's shit, isn't it? Because you know they probably want some support, but I've been doing this for 10 years now, and I don't feel as shit as I would have done 5 years ago, but I've been doing this and I've got a fair bit of knowledge and what exists out there. So for me, if someone goes, oh God, I can't believe we can't get this person on a program, I go, well, don't worry, where are we referring them? Who are we going to bring for them? There's things out there. However, we also came across multiple examples whereby there wasn't anything out there for families, and practitioners often describe this as making them feel helpless, frustrated, angry, and sad. So overall then, our emergent findings show that interactions between social care practitioners and migrant families are complex and can reify and challenge the presence of everyday bordering practices in both bureaucratic and tacit ways. On one level, we show that normative conceptualizations of family can shape how some practitioners understand ethnic minorities and migrant family practices. This can act as an everyday border by defining which practices do and do not belong, influenced by both post-colonial ideas of which family practices are legitimate and the limited diversity within the workforce of these organisations. Subsequently, this potentially has implications for the ways in which support needs are heard and or assessed. What is pervasive, however, is evidence of social care practitioners engaging in a range of strategies to navigate and challenge the everyday borders encountered, and subsequently the support that they are able to provide to families that have migrated. We also found practitioners to be open and reflective in their practice approach. For example, as a result of engagement in the study, practitioners requested that we develop and deliver a workshop to explore the use of race and ethnicity labels in social care practice, as well as processes of racialisation and their impact on ethnic minority groups. In this way, through collaboration with practitioners, we were able to begin decolonising this aspect of practice with families. As advocated by Gaminda Bambra, we've contributed in a small way to the process of reinscribing other cultural traditions into narratives of modernity.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. I think, again, that worked really well after Joe's. I can really see some of the connections there across both of your works and how some of the conceptualizations that we discussed with Joe can be seen coming out in the empirical work that you've been undertaking. So that's really great, thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Fallon Cabral, and Fallon is studying for her PhD at Pierre Freiburg. And her partly autoethnographic PhD project is located at the interface of racism and family studies, and it uses queer, post-colonial, feminist, and phenomenological approaches to examine how race, racism, and other intersectional power relations are negotiated in families of queer, non-binary, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Germany. And she describes herself as aspiring revolutionary feminist family research Auntie. And her presentation is entitled Bad Brown Anti-Family Research Manifesto. Thanks, Fallon.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to present my Bad Brown Anti-Family Research Manifesto. My name is Fallon. I am based in Berlin, and here are some labels about me. I am a PhD candidate. I'm actually quite new to family studies, although I'm studying for like 4 to 5 years already on my research project. I'm actually based in migration studies, post-colonial studies, and racism studies. And everything I'm talking about today is for the German context or for the German speaking context. And I've been working in academia many years. I have a working class background. I identify as woman of color and queer. And as you told, in my research project, I'm researching how race and racisms are negotiated in families as a wide, queer, inclusive construct, and how this impacts the intersectional becomings of BIPOC in Germany. I conducted biographical interviews, 6, and include autoethnographic musings. And as I'm a big fan of autoethnography, this talk will also be partly autoethnographic. So yeah, here you can see my my thoughts on my talk today. So there's the aspect of my research, my family research, the idea of bad brown aunties, and my manifesto. And my aim is to share my lived experiences as a German feminist of color in white academia, trying to do family research that is kind of decolonizing. And I would like to invite you to explore the potential of the bad brown auntie figure for decolonizing family and relationship studies. It's inspired by a podcast I will get to, which is called Bad Brown Aunties, which is from New York, I guess. And this manifesto was actually started as a fun idea to loosen up a bit writing my theory chapter. And now, yeah, it's a talk and a manifesto in the end, if I get there, if I'm fast enough. So there's a double research gap in Germany, or in German-speaking research. It is that there's family and how race is negotiated in families. This is not included in racism studies, and it's also not included in family studies. Race and racism kind of don't exist. There's racist research on families of color, Muslim families, Black families, but there's not this decolonizing approach there. And so, yeah, I would like to ask, where are these pioneering aunties in German-speaking academia who don't do that? And it's really nice for me to hear, it was nice to hear the talks of Joe and Julie about what's happening in Britain, but it's not happening in Germany. So yeah, this is the context. So why auntie, not mother or sister? Yeah, I was trying to decenter hegemonic norms of the nuclear family, which is focused on blood and biology. And these norms have an impact on daily lives of people in research, or like with the care practitioners you just spoke about, but also in for asylum politics or migration politics, who belongs to the family, who can migrate as an asylum seeker and who can't. And interestingly, also Joe spoke about extended family, how important it is to include extended family, and aunties and uncles are seen as forgotten kin in family studies, which is more progressive, and actually very crucial in diasporic communities in the West and the rest of the world. And it's an elder that is not mother or father, but takes up care duties. And there's a big, long tradition of queer, transgender, non-conforming, Black, Indigenous people of color who have this tradition of having other mothers, community mothers, ballroom mothers, and it's part of Black history. And I would like to ask the question, what can we see if we include aunties in our family research? Aunties with a star as a queer, transgender, non-conforming auntie. Yeah. And one really great video is the video of Lahore, Rajasthan. It's called How to Be an Auntie, where Lahore, a South Asian drag queen in the US, speaks about aunties and their bad reputation, and the question of what happens if you reclaim auntyhood as lived experience and survival strategy for women and queers. And she defines aunties as old, having bad style, taking up space, gossip, overfeed everyone. And in her talk, and it's really recommendable, you can see how she transforms this and speaks about resistance and survival. And I think it's really interesting and important actually to include aunties with a star to family studies and BIPOC aunties. So next, yeah. Why a bad brown auntie family research manifesto? Because BIPOC aunties with the star and aunties in general are left out of German family studies, and BIPOC are just research objects. And this manifesto wants to challenge the limited understandings of families of BIPOC by conspiring with bad brown aunties in art, culture, politics, and academia. Going to culture. This podcast, Bad Brown Aunties, is hosted by two queer brown immigrants, Rage and Tanu, and looks at queer elders in the community. And Rage, one of the hosts, says, one of the things we're trying to do with this podcast is to make sure that we're challenging limited understandings of aunties. As queer South Asians, for instance, it is extremely frustrating that transgender, non-conforming, and queer aunties are often left out of the conversation. So extended family is left out, and queer extended family even more. And in my research, I'm trying to find out what my interview partners think, what made them who they are today, and what who and what helped them to deal with racism. And they speak about some people which I would label bad brown aunties. And thinking of my own becoming and growing up, I would have loved to have these both, like Alok Fight Menon or Karim Kubchandani, who's Lahore Vajstan, this Desi drag queen, to help me question my sexuality and think about how my racial socialization could also be empowering and not only something to be ashamed of. And yeah, so do I too have these auntie figures in my academic life in Germany? Do I have bad brown family scholars? So if I want to study how race and racism are negotiated in families of BIPOC, and if I want to do it from an intersectional perspective and with an approach not about us, without us, who is there to help me, to guide me? Not so many people, and certainly no family scholars. And why not? Because academia is so wide. And how to survive academia without trying to change myself. And in a recent job interview for a postdoc position, I was told that German family studies were not quite there to include queer family notions and post-colonial feminist approaches. Not ready for me, and I should possibly level down a bit. And luckily, I have uplifting bad brown auntie figures in my community in Germany that can relate to my experiences of being the only one, even if we are not in the same research area. These brilliant, wise aunties and elders outside academia share with me that what they have learned about research, academia, racism, family, and intersectional becoming. So they exist, but not in family studies. And we have examples. And it's so frustrating because it's 40 years of knowledge production, and it's not spilling over to German-speaking academia. April Few Demo says, in the early 1980s, Black feminist scholars such as Patricia Hill Collins, Barbara Smith, Patricia Bell Scott, and Gloria Hull delineated a foundation for Afrocentric revisionist history and family sociology, while, and this is so important, integrating an ethic of care and a call for social justice on the behalf of those studied and simultaneously challenging the normative gaze of whiteness. It's all there. So, but there's also a huge legacy of Black women of color, feminists, and background aunties coming up against these walls of whiteness. And we have lively and vibrant practices of queer family making and theory that's made of lived experiences that might not be found in German-speaking academia yet, but are essential to our survival in white Western nations. And German, Swiss, and Austrian BIPOC feminist scholars and activists have always existed and fought back, but are rather made invisible. And I also asked, why do they miss in family studies? Audre Lorde, a member of the Combahee River Collective, was in Berlin and met some of my bad brown aunties. They're trying to change the discourse on migrant, Muslim, non-Western Roma families from inside and outside academia. It's just, there's something happening. And these bad brown aunties in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland argue alongside with bad brown aunties in the US that lived familial experiences can't be reduced to this cisgendered, heteronormative white Western mother, father, child model. And Auntie Loretta said that, or quotes, that mothering can be seen as creating, nurturing, affirming, and supporting life, and does not have to be tied to biological mothers, and can be lived by everyone. And I also like the second thought. Mothering, radically redefined, is the glad gifting of one's talents, ideas, intellect, and creativity to the universe without recompense. And also this we can find with Auntie. So coming to my manifesto, which I just developed for the talk, because I decided not to include it in my PhD project, but it's my offer to decolonize family and relationship studies, and it's a world premiere. I didn't discuss this really before. And the first point is queer, trans, gender non-conforming BIPOC aunties are important in family research. BIPOC liberation should be an overall orientation of family research and research methods. We should listen to bad brown aunties in academia and beyond, and lived experiences of queer, transgender, non-conforming BIPOC are key to intersectional family knowledge production. Family, sexuality, as well as gender need to be decolonized and queered. And we as researchers need to challenge and monitor colonial, white, patriarchal, and binary thinking in our own work. And last but not least, nothing about us without us. Include us. Thank you all, and especially thanks to my bad brown aunties, and I think one of them sits in the audience as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fallon, for that really invigorating presentation. And I hope we can discuss a bit more in the Q&A about what this means, how we will kind of manifest this manifesto, as it were. And I really want to hear a bit more about these bad brown aunties, including the ones in our audience today. Okay, so finally we have Hannah Jones presenting. And Hannah is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. And she's co-author of Go Home, The Politics of Immigration Controversies, co-editor of Stories of Cosmopolitan Belonging, Emotion and Location, and author of Negotiating Cohesion, Inequality and Change, Uncomfortable Positions in Local Government, which won the BSA Philip Abrams Prize for Best First and Sole Authored Monograph in UK Sociology. I guess that was in 2013. And her newest book, Violent Ignorance, draws attention to uncomfortable political questions about belonging, race, migration, and history that are usually ignored, and the continuing violence that results. And her talk today is entitled Belonging and Ownership, Family as a Stand-in for Race and Settler-Colonial Identity Claims.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Catherine. You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. And I've got my trans-species family sitting on me while I talk, so that's okay. So I'm going to talk today around some research that I've been fiddling with for several years, but really which began as thinking about how family is used as a stand-in for race and nation, and whether there's a way of reappropriating that to break apart the kind of racializing logics of those connected concepts. But it comes up against the problem of whiteness. Okay, so I'm going to try and do a whistle-stop tour, but really starting from the idea that family, race, and nation are well known to be connected as logics. You can think about that in terms of rhetorical languages around motherland, fatherland, the ideas of, you know, our children and grandchildren are the future to be united around. Also questions of everyday intimacy and mapped in works like those on the screen, particularly Anne-Laura Stoller's historical anthropological work on technology, which really breaks down the technologies of race making in colonial contexts in terms of who bedded and wedded whom, and the rights that were then had to be mapped out and measured in terms of family relationships in order to measure and preserve whiteness and other forms of citizenship and personhood. And in more present day contexts, we think about that in terms of family migration, who counts as a family, who's recognised as the right kind of family member to be allowed to cross a border or be present in a nation. So there's quite a lot of work on those various bodies of understanding, and I'm interested in thinking, can we use the lived experience of those deep connections to family, both present and ideas of historical family, to disrupt simplified ideas about connections through race and nation? And the way into that at the moment is around thinking through family histories. That's what I'm exploring. So you can see here some of the kind of, on this slide, some of the examples of cultural production that reflects the kind of wider interest and ongoing and continuing and booming interest in tracing ancestral histories and the meaning people attach to knowing who their ancestors were or finding out more. And that's not just from things well-known programs like Who Do You Think You Are and long-standing family history tracing, but the increased access to that through new technologies, both digitized records and websites like ancestry.com, which make it much easier to start these kind of journeys, and DNA testing, which has a whole load of other questions, but is again about thinking about connection to the past and meaning, and what that means for a person's identity, belonging, and rights in the present. And even where there are some examples that try to disrupt some of the more fixed logics of direct meaning between longer ancestries or expectations of cultural purity. So there are some things like that, which in the top right, there's an image which is called Watch the Ad, that has shaken racists by using DNA tests to reveal people's mixed origins. And that was an advert for a travel company, but they made a viral video, which was lots of people saying who they thought what they thought their ancestry was, getting a DNA test, and then finding, according to the DNA test, they had ancestors from parts of the world, countries that they detested before, and thinking that changes everything. So that's an attempt to kind of disrupt bordering in the longer sense. And the current radio programme Descendants, which is on Radio 4, which is mapping, using Catherine Hall's project around legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, to talk to people whose ancestors were either enslaved or owners of slaves, and think about how those histories are connected and what that might mean through the personal stories of present day people. So there's different types of ways that these family histories are trying to maybe disrupt or reconnect or disconnect from absolutist, racializing and nationalizing ideas. They still somewhat depend on even the Descendants' work, and especially the kind of travel company DNA journey, still rely on some kind of fundamental link to who our ancestors were and what that means about us. So family, whether biological or not, as some kind of personal essence. And I'm exploring this in terms of the relationship between Britain and Australia, which is obviously infused with whiteness and colonial histories. Not just because my partner's from Australia, I was already doing it, but partly because of the kind of ongoing idea of this special relationship that Australia is where Britons aspire to in terms of national debate around immigration control. So you can see an image there from the Australian government used to discourage people making journeys by sea, informal journeys by sea to Australia. No way, you won't make Australia home, which was just before and perhaps inspired the go home or face arrest if you're in the UK illegally UK government advertising campaign. The appeal that we're told, which started with a Labour politician, actually Liam Byrne, and then all main political parties in the UK have talked about wanting an Australian immigration policy, and they talk about that being a skills points-based system. But it obviously alludes also to offshoring of irregular migrants in detention, which continues to come back in UK debate, and also the White Australia policy, which was part of the Australian Constitution from it becoming an independent country in 1901 and up until the mid 20th century, and which is what you can see advertising for there in the middle sign, encouraging white British men for the land and women for the home to populate Australia. And then the very rightmost image is a more recent satirical kind of response to the far-right immigration policies, the absolutist immigration policies, which use that slogan, "Stop the boats," and alluding to the invasion of Australia by Britain. So all of that kind of connections with the legislative is long-standing, but so is this idea of our Australian cousins from Britain and of the crimson line of kinship from Australia to Britain. So that it seems like an important place to think about the family history tracing and the work that does. So I'm going to talk a little in relation to that from 4 interviews I did as part of a pilot study with women in their 60s and 70s who were white Australians who were involved in tracing their family history to the UK and also to Ireland. But I recruited them on the basis they were looking at the UK. All of them had different kinds of connections, so but they were very much felt like they had an attachment to UK, Britain or England, depending how they phrased it. Maureen actually was born in the UK and came over as a 10-pound pom. Some of them were married to Brits or people who were first generation, and others, and they'd all visited the UK and maybe had children living there. So what I wanted to talk to them about was this sense of belonging, whether tracing their family history had made them think differently about their relationship to Australia or to Britain. And as I said, they felt a deep belonging to both, but that's what they expressed in the interviews. And here I'm talking about belonging not just as a simple feeling of nostalgia, but as a political feeling, as a political issue. So Nira Yuval Davis's ideas of belonging as being about social locations, identifications, emotional attachments, and ethical and political values, that emotional attachments are politically powerful. But what became clear as I looked at this data is that a lot of the belonging here, though it wasn't named as such, worked through questions of whiteness, which were related to, were articulated as family heritage. So that idea of belonging as ownership is not just a pun here, but is about actual property relations. So drawing on Cheryl Harris, an African-American scholar who has the key idea about whiteness as ownership, in terms of writing about the US, whiteness being a property relation, you either were property or owned property. And then developing that around Indigenous lives, Aileen Morton Robinson, as an Indigenous Australian scholar, writes about whiteness as possession. So in terms of Australia in particular, the legal jurisdiction of sovereignty that governs Australia being about white ideas of possession and ownership, which already automatically exclude Indigenous peoples from having any ownership of the land in which they lived or claim to it. Or if they do have a claim, or if any non-white immigrants have a claim, it's always at the behest of white possession ownership and enabling that. So to see what I mean, this is a really striking statement from Liz, one of the participants. She's talking here about going to the UK And she says, you could feel the soil, put your hands on the rocks, and being a spiritual person, I felt I belong here. This is part of me. I can put my hands on the rocks and say I belong here. I'm part of this. And that's obviously a really intimate, personal, strongly felt and real feeling. It really sounds a lot like some of the descriptions that have been talked about in terms of white Australian belonging to Australia as well. In a recent article in the Journal of Family History, Ashley Barnwell writes about the kind of narratives and colonial storytelling of family historians in Australia writing about their settler ancestors, and that sometimes there's very little talk about Indigenous interactions, but sometimes there is the use of this kind of spiritual language, which becomes across as a kind of, in that context, as a kind of omission or appropriation of ideas about nature as custodian. So there's resonances here, but here it's talking about this deep belonging to the UK as someone who was born and always lived in Australia. And yet she still feels that she can have that connection with the land in the UK. So she'd always lived in Australia, Liz, but she had actually spent a year or so as a student, as a young person in England in the 70s. And she says here that she was made an illegal alien while she was in England as Britain joined the common market. So she says Australians were made to go home, but I didn't want to go home. And actually, she wasn't made to go home because it turns out she could get her visa and her status regularized because she had an English grandfather. So she still came under the patriality rules of British immigration, evolving British immigration policy. Okay, thanks, Catherine. That show that enabled people with white ancestry who were Commonwealth nationals to continue to have the right that she asserts to be in the UK. But she was indignant because it hadn't occurred to her, and this is the kind of whiteness coming through, even though she's not wanting to name it as that. Whereas other people like Jamaicans or people born in the UK, like she says, and Indians and that, or Indian descent, would have the right, whereas my grandfather died on behalf of England. And of course, their grandfathers may well have, as well as also Commonwealth citizens. And she's somehow counterposing that, where initially the question was whether the turn to the European Union, as it would be, away from the Commonwealth was the problem. Of course, I've run out of time, but I'm going to try and quickly talk about this kind of belonging in Britain as much as I do here, which also came, but then there were these kind of caveats. So Pat talked about if she lived there, she might have problems with public transport. And what I didn't follow up on that at the time, but I think what that alludes to is something that Norma also talked about here. So first of all, she's talking about feeling in an alien country in the campus where she works as an administrator in Australia because of all the international students. So again, asserting the kind of white ownership taken away, this alien country, but she compares it to going to London and thinking, where's all the English people? So there's an expectation of whiteness and that overriding other kinds of belonging, which she also found when encountering border guards in the UK who weren't white effectively, but although her heritage is that country. So she's saying here, her heritage is the UK. She feels like she has that ownership and expectation and should have the right to live there. Though for Norma, she didn't have the close enough ancestral connection to get the patriality rights to be present. I'm going to skip that last slide for time, but the key kind of ideas here are that what I'm coming to is that the persistence of racializing family logics is important to think through at both the intimate and geopolitical levels, because the intimate levels are what inform any kind of political movement to alter those power relations. So where white Australian belonging to Britain is clearly linked to familial connections and ancestry connections, and they are articulated in these ideas of ownership or entitlement, even if to some extent those exist in law in terms of the ability to have visas and to travel and to resettle in either for some, but they also in terms of expectations. And you can see the current governments talk about trying to make that connection, and Australia's persistent public policy, which tends to think of itself in Europe or sometimes connected to North America. But this is never named, although it was named until the mid-20th century in terms of race. Much more so now, familial language is easier to use. But you can see in some of these illustrative examples that race comes through in that idea of inheritance. And even where people recognize the kind of questions of historic indigenous injustices, which I've not had time to talk about, or current border injustices in terms of their relatives may have gone through similar things at a different time to current arrivals. It was really hard, that didn't follow through into a wider politics in most cases. So there's this deep feeling of family, which is also a question of ownership and entitlement, which is not removed by just knowing about the contradictions of it. So like I said, I started the project trying to think, is there a way to develop politics of solidarity through looking at family as it's actually lived and imagining that alongside race and nation as they're actually lived, and how they could be lived differently. But perhaps identifying the racializing logics of family and nation and trying to work through those together with those of us who continue, because it informs everything within our lives, there might be some possibilities there. And it would be great to hear if anyone thinks there are. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. That was really interesting. And just from my own perspective, someone Irish living in the UK, and the connections between Ireland and Australia, which are yeah, really different. And I wondered, yeah, a comparison would be, I know you mentioned that there was this woman who kind of felt a belonging to Ireland and the UK. Of course, Ireland is a, you know, ex-colonized country, and whether that makes any difference, or whether the kind of the whiteness of the Irish is sort of trumps that, the fact that we're a republic as well, not a member of the Commonwealth. Yeah, so many kind of intersecting kind of issues that could potentially come out. Yeah, I wonder whether there's the sameness coming out around ownership and nation, and kind of feeling like I belong to Britain. You know, Britain is my motherland, in the same way that, of course, the Irish give out passports fairly easily, to say the least, unlike the British. But I don't know if you can comment on that, because I know you only had one kind of partially Irish person in your.
Yeah, I don't think I can comment on it from that small study, but I mean, Catherine Nash's work on origins and tracing to Ireland is quite interesting. I think she's more looking at Americans tracing their history, and the way that yeah, some of those kind of logics of ownership and belonging, and how that relates to actual current Irish people in Ireland. I'd have to remind myself to give you a proper answer, but that, yeah, I think that complicates this further. But but in the family history tracing is not necessarily so much part of the story, because of the nationhood connections between.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, and thank you to all four speakers. If you want to turn on your cameras, so that we can start a conversation going. So as I've said, it's fairly easy now. If you want to ask a question, just put up your